You are welcome to yet another episode of HN What's Your Say? The #1 listening show, where we discuss real issues with real people like you. We are still featuring R. Kelly. Real name Robert Sylvester Kelly. Also known as the R&B King. In our modern era, we often assume that heinous criminals receive the stiffest and most brutal punishments. But what if I told you that one of the most vilified figures of our time, and I am speaking of R. Kelly, has been penalized far more severely than many cold-blooded killers whose crimes defy comprehension? This episode tells the tale of Susan Wright, the so-called blue-eyed butcher, who tied her husband to a bed and stabbed him nearly 200 times, and yet after only 16 years behind bars she walked free, and contrasts that with the unprecedented prosecutorial zeal and extreme sentencing meted out to R. Kelly, who never murdered a soul. In Houston, Texas, back in the early morning hours of January 13, 2003, Susan Lucille Wright unleashed one of the most brutal domestic homicides in recent memory. Her husband Jeffrey Wright was found to have been brutally killed in their master bedroom. His body bound, blood-soaked everywhere, and with at least 193 stab wounds. Investigators later documented the wounds in painful detail. 41 stab wounds to his face, 23 to his neck, 46 on his chest, 22 on his abdomen, 19 to his legs, 23 to his arms, plus others in his groin areas, back and head. Some of the wounds were so deep that one knife tip broke off in the skull. Ligatures, neckties and bathrobe sashes were wrapped around his wrists and ankles. The prosecution alleged Susan had tied him defenseless to the bed before stabbing him. Susan Wright dragged Jeff's body into the backyard, placing him in a shallow grave she had dug near a patio, and attempted to conceal the crime by painting one wall in the bedroom and cleaning with bleach. For 5 days, she maintained the facade that her husband had simply disappeared. Finally, after the family dog unearthed part of the buried body, detectives discovered the gruesome scene. A mattress drenched in blood, walls and ceiling splattered, and attempts at cleanup betrayed by residual spatter and bleach evidence. Susan later confessed to her mother, "Mama, it wasn't me. I snapped." She also told her attorneys that she believed in a kind of psychotic denial that her husband might still be alive and rise from the grave. The defense would later argue that Susan had suffered years of abuse, both physical and psychological, at Jeff's hands, and that she acted in self-defense. However, with a man tied to the bed and killed defenseless, this is still hard to believe. They claimed that on the night in question, Jeff, agitated and possibly under influence, brandished a knife, and that Susan struggled to defend herself. According to her account, she tied Jeff to the bed out of fear to restrain him so he could not retaliate. However, the prosecution, which was led by Kelly Siegler, told a starkly different story. They argued that Susan lured Jeff into a sexual scenario, used ties to bind him to the bed, and then stabbed him repeatedly as a cold and premeditated murder for gain. Siegler even brought the actual bed from the crime scene into court, reconstructing how she claimed Susan had tied her husband and stabbed him, dramatizing the scene before the jury. After about 5.5 hours of deliberations, the jury convicted Susan of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The case didn't end there. Susan's appellate attorneys argued that her original defense counsel had been ineffective during the punishment phase, failing to properly present evidence of domestic abuse and mitigating circumstances. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted a new sentencing hearing, ruling that she was entitled to a fresh penalty phase. Her sentence was then reduced to 20 years as a result. Under her new term, Susan became eligible for parole in 2014, though she was denied this parole that year and again in 2017. On December 30 of 2020, after serving approximately 16 years behind bars, Susan Wright was released on parole.
Susan Wright is home.
Certainly. Is there anything that y'all would want to say?
No, ma'am. I would just like privacy. Please respect that.
Despite the grotesque nature of her crime, the sheer brutality used, the binding, the disposal and the cleanup attempt to evade the law, Susan Wright walked free 16 years later. Some observers called her early release shocking. But in this nation of inequality, others saw it as a correction of overzealous prosecution and insufficient protections for abuse survivors forced into desperate acts. In contrast, Robert Sylvester Kelly, known to the world as R. Kelly, has never been convicted of murder, and no direct act of physical violence to a complainant aside from consensual sexual acts with multiple women. Yet his criminal prosecutions have resulted in decades-long prison terms treated in many quarters as among the harshest ever imposed upon a celebrity. Kelly's legal trouble began years ago with accusations of sexual abuse, alleged manipulation of minors, and the said production of illicit recordings. In a Chicago and New York federal courts, Kelly was indicted and convicted on a range of counts involving child pornography, child enticement, and conspiracy. He was sentenced on February 23 of 2023 to 20 years, but the court ordered 19 of those years to run concurrent with his already existing New York 30-year sentence, and 1 additional year consecutively, effectively bringing his total to 31 years in prison. An indirect life sentence considering his current age. Earlier on, he had already been convicted in New York on the alleged and unproven racketeering and sex trafficking charges, and had received the rather unfair 30-year sentence. Most recently in 2025, a federal appeals court against maliciously upheld those convictions and affirmed the 30-year sentence. Prosecutors in Chicago had requested an additional 25 years, arguing these new crimes should stack on top of the New York sentence. If this had been granted, Kelly would essentially be serving 55 years in federal prison, or in practice a more than life equivalent term. Notwithstanding, Kelly is effectively barred from re-entering society until nearly 2054. In other words, a man who is not proven to have taken a single life is being punished more severely, and more relentlessly than many with far more violent and obvious convictions. Finally, let's look deeper at how and why Kelly's penalties have become so draconian, and whether it reflects impartial justice, or a kind of legal persecution. Compare the outcomes. Susan Wright, after a murder so brutal it defies comprehension, eventually walked free only 16 years later and still young enough to kill another man. R. Kelly, who is accused of unclear and unproven sexual wrongdoing, will likely die in prison. Why the stark contrast? Let us examine several possible forces at work. Prosecutors in Kelly's case exercised extraordinarily aggressive strategies, calling string of accusers under pseudonyms, dramatizing alleged grooming patterns, and asking jurors to view videos and records spanning decades ago past the statutes of limitations. The state in fact exaggerated and embellished the narrative to inflame the jury. In the Susan Wright trial, while prosecutorial theatrics were also present, the case remained a more contained domestic homicide story. And besides, the prosecutors who were caught by the FBI illegally stealing and misusing R. Kelly's restricted prison communications with his attorneys have since remained untouched. We cannot help but believe R. Kelly has been targeted by this racist government for his skin color, and by Sony for his music. This is not justice. That is all we had for you today on HN What's Your Say? To keep updated whenever we post a new video, subscribe to this channel now. Also remember to hit the bell icon and enable notifications. And feel free to share your opinions with us in the comment section below, and let us know if you would like us to publish your views in our next release. We value all our subscribers' opinions.